What if I told you that the most terrifying villain in modern anime isn't just evil for the sake of being evil, but represents something far more disturbing about human nature itself? Ryomen Sukuna, the king of curses in Jujutsu Kaisen, operates on a psychological framework so precise, so methodically constructed, that understanding his mind reveals uncomfortable truths about power, identity, and the darkest corners of human psychology. Today we're dissecting Sukuna's psyche using clinical psychology, psychoanalytic theory, and behavioral science to understand why this character doesn't just frighten us, but captivates us on a primal level. By the end of this analysis, you'll never see Sukuna the same way again, and you might recognize some uncomfortable patterns that exist in our own world. Let's begin with what makes Sukuna psychologically distinct from typical antagonists. Unlike villains driven by revenge, ideology, or tragic circumstances, Sukuna represents what psychologists call pure agentic evil, a concept explored extensively by researchers studying malevolent behavior. He doesn't need justification for his actions because his entire psychological framework operates on a fundamentally different set of values than conventional morality. This isn't psychopathy in the clinical sense we'll discuss later, but rather something more philosophically profound. Sukuna has constructed an internally consistent worldview where might genuinely makes right, and he lives this philosophy with unwavering authenticity. From a Nietzschean perspective, Sukuna embodies the concept of the Übermensch taken to its most extreme conclusion, someone who has completely transcended conventional morality and created his own value system based purely on strength and self-interest. When we examine Sukuna through the lens of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, we see something fascinating. Jung proposed that the human psyche contains what he called the shadow, the repository of repressed desires, primitive impulses, and aspects of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge. Sukuna doesn't have a shadow in the traditional sense because he has fully integrated what would be shadow material into his conscious identity. He experiences no cognitive dissonance between impulse and action, no guilt mediating between desire and behavior. This complete integration of the shadow is what makes him so psychologically powerful and terrifying. Where most individuals, even villains, experience some internal conflict between their darker impulses and their self-concept, Sukuna operates with perfect psychological alignment. He wants something, he takes it. He feels like destroying something, he destroys it. This absence of internal psychological friction is extraordinarily rare and represents a kind of terrible psychological efficiency. From a psychoanalytic perspective drawing on Freudian theory, Sukuna's personality structure reveals something equally compelling. Freud proposed that the psyche consists of three components: the id, our primitive desires, the ego, our rational mediator, and the superego, our internalized moral conscience. In most individuals, these three forces exist in dynamic tension, with the ego constantly negotiating between the id's demands and the superego's restrictions. Sukuna appears to have completely eliminated his superego, or perhaps never developed one in the first place. His ego serves his id directly, with no moral intermediary. When he makes strategic decisions, like his calculated approach to regaining his full power, he's using ego functions like planning and reality testing, but exclusively in service of id-driven desires for dominance, pleasure, and destruction. This makes him psychologically streamlined in a way that's both efficient and monstrous. The question of whether Sukuna meets clinical criteria for any psychological disorders requires careful consideration. When we examine the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, we might initially consider antisocial personality disorder, which includes traits like disregard for others' rights, lack of remorse, impulsivity, and aggression. However, applying clinical diagnoses to Sukuna becomes complicated because he exists in a fundamentally different context than the human subjects these diagnostic criteria were designed for. He's not a human with a disorder. He's a curse, an entity born from concentrated human fear and negativity. What looks like pathology from a human perspective is actually his natural state of being. This distinction matters because it shifts our analysis from what's wrong with Sukuna to what does Sukuna's psychology tell us about the nature of power and predation. Sukuna's relationship with power reveals something crucial about dominance psychology and what researchers call social dominance orientation. Studies in social psychology show that some individuals are primarily motivated by hierarchical superiority and actively seek to dominate others. Sukuna takes this to its absolute extreme. His famous declaration that he exists above all others isn't delusional grandiosity, it's a statement of his fundamental worldview. He has constructed his entire identity around being the apex predator, and every interaction he has reinforces this self-concept. When he toys with opponents before killing them, when he makes deals with conditions that serve only his amusement, when he shows occasional interest in strong opponents like Megumi, these aren't random behaviors but expressions of a coherent psychological system built around dominance, maintenance, and the exercise of absolute power. What makes Sukuna's psychology particularly sophisticated is his demonstrated capacity for strategic thinking and delayed gratification, despite his apparent impulsivity. This reveals what psychologists call executive function, the ability to plan, control impulses when necessary, and work toward long-term goals. When Sukuna agrees to conditions for possessing Yuji's body, when he patiently waits for opportunities to manifest, when he carefully observes the cursed techniques of others, he's demonstrating that his psychology isn't purely reactive or primitive. He can suppress immediate desires in service of greater future rewards, which is actually a marker of psychological sophistication. This combination of strategic patience and explosive violence when he chooses to act makes him unpredictable and therefore more psychologically threatening. We can't dismiss him as a mindless force of destruction because his mind is always calculating, always several moves ahead. The developmental question of how Sukuna became what he is leads us into fascinating territory about the formation of moral consciousness. Developmental psychologists like Lawrence Kohlberg studied how moral reasoning develops from childhood through adulthood, progressing through stages from self-interest to universal ethical principles. Sukuna appears to have either never progressed beyond the earliest stage of moral development, where might makes right, or he consciously rejected more sophisticated moral frameworks as constraints on his power. The fragmentary glimpses we get of his past suggest he existed in a world where strength was the only currency that mattered, and he became the strongest. In psychological terms, his moral development was shaped entirely by reinforcement of dominance behavior. Every time his strength allowed him to take what he wanted, that behavior was reinforced, creating a feedback loop that crystallized his worldview over centuries. Sukuna's interactions with Yuji Itadori provide incredible insight into his psychology through the concept of the host-parasite relationship, but also something more complex. From Sukuna's perspective, sharing a body with Yuji is an exercise in psychological dominance. He's not just physically present, but constantly working to undermine Yuji's sense of control and autonomy. When he takes over Yuji's body to cause destruction, he's not just pursuing his own goals, but deliberately traumatizing his host, knowing that Yuji will bear the psychological burden of what Sukuna does with his body. This is psychological warfare at its most intimate and cruel. It reveals that Sukuna understands human psychology deeply enough to exploit it, even if he doesn't experience human emotions like guilt or empathy himself. He knows what will hurt Yuji most because he understands the psychological mechanisms of trauma, responsibility, and identity, even though these concepts don't constrain his own behavior. The concept of empathy, or rather its complete absence, is central to understanding Sukuna's psychology. Neuroscientific research has shown that empathy involves specific neural circuits that allow us to simulate others' emotional states and respond with appropriate concern. When these circuits are damaged or underdeveloped, we see profound deficits in social behavior. Sukuna doesn't just lack empathy, he seems to find the concept genuinely incomprehensible and perhaps even contemptible when he encounters people trying to save others or sacrificing themselves for moral principles. His reaction isn't cruelty exactly, but rather a kind of dismissive bewilderment. To him, these behaviors are evidence of weakness, of allowing social conditioning to override self-interest. This perspective reveals that Sukuna has constructed a complete alternative framework for understanding human behavior, one where empathy and compassion are evolutionary mistakes rather than virtues. What Sukuna teaches us about human psychology extends beyond the character himself to what he represents in our collective psyche. From a Jungian perspective, Sukuna functions as a cultural shadow figure, embodying all the impulses that civilized society requires us to repress: the desire for absolute power, the pleasure in domination, the wish to be free from all moral constraints. Our fascination with Sukuna reveals something about our own repressed desires for power and freedom from social restriction. This doesn't mean we want to be like Sukuna, but rather that he represents a kind of terrible authenticity. Someone who has completely eliminated the gap between desire and action that most of us navigate daily. In psychological terms, he's compelling because he's doing what our superegos prevent us from even fully acknowledging we might want to do. The terror Sukuna inspires operates on multiple psychological levels simultaneously. There's the immediate physical threat he represents, certainly, but more profoundly, there's the existential threat to our moral frameworks. When we encounter Sukuna, we're confronted with someone for whom our ethical arguments are meaningless, someone who exists completely outside the social contracts that make civilization possible. This touches on deep evolutionary fears about encountering predators who see us only as prey, but it also challenges our belief that reason and morality are universal. Sukuna demonstrates that these are choices, conventions, and that someone sufficiently powerful can simply opt out of them entirely. This is psychologically destabilizing because it reveals the contingent nature of the moral structures we depend on for our sense of safety and meaning. From a clinical perspective, if we were to assess Sukuna's capacity for change or rehabilitation, the prognosis would be non-existent. And here's why. Psychological change requires several prerequisites: some degree of distress with one's current state, capacity for insight into one's own patterns, and motivation to change. Sukuna experiences none of these. He's perfectly satisfied with who and what he is. He has complete insight into his own nature and embraces it fully. And he has absolutely no motivation to change because his current psychological framework serves his interests perfectly. This is what makes him such an effective representation of irredeemable evil. He's not evil because of trauma that could be healed, or ignorance that could be educated, or pain that could be addressed. He's evil by choice, by philosophy, and by preference. His psychology is completely stable and self-reinforcing, which means there's no therapeutic intervention, no redemptive arc, no possibility of change. He is what he has chosen to be, with full awareness and complete commitment. The broader implications of Sukuna's psychology extend to understanding real-world power dynamics and what happens when individuals gain power without corresponding accountability. While real humans rarely achieve Sukuna's level of pure amoral self-interest, we do see patterns in history and contemporary society where individuals in positions of extreme power begin to operate with decreasing regard for conventional morality. Psychological research on power shows that it can reduce empathy, increase risk-taking, and make individuals more focused on their own desires while becoming less aware of constraints or others' needs. Sukuna represents the endpoint of this trajectory. What happens when power becomes absolute and long-standing enough to completely erode any remaining moral framework? He's a thought experiment made flesh about what unchecked power does to psychology over centuries. Understanding Sukuna's psychology also illuminates why he works so effectively as an antagonist in narrative terms. Story theorists and psychologists who study fiction note that the most compelling villains are those who pose both external and internal threats to protagonists. Sukuna threatens Yuji physically by existing in his body, but more importantly, he threatens Yuji's identity and moral framework. Every time Sukuna uses Yuji's body to kill innocent people, he's not just causing external harm, but attacking Yuji's sense of self and his belief that he can protect people. This internal psychological warfare makes Sukuna more than just an obstacle to overcome. He's a constant existential threat. From a psychological standpoint, this creates sustained tension because the threat never fully recedes even when Sukuna isn't actively manifesting. He's always there, always waiting, always representing the possibility that control could be lost at any moment. Sukuna's aesthetic presentation and behavior patterns also reveal psychological sophistication in his understanding of intimidation and psychological dominance. His appearance, his manner of speaking, his casual attitude toward violence, these aren't random but carefully cultivated elements of what we might call his personal brand of terror. He understands that unpredictability creates anxiety, that casual cruelty is more unnerving than rage, that treating serious matters with amusement demonstrates superiority. These are all psychological tactics, whether consciously employed or intuitively understood, that maximize his psychological impact on others. When he smiles during violence, when he speaks about death and destruction in casual tones, he's creating cognitive dissonance in observers between the gravity of his actions and his effective presentation. This dissonance is psychologically disturbing in a way that straightforward evil isn't, because it violates our expectations about how emotions should correspond to actions. In conclusion, Sukuna represents something rare in fictional villains. A psychologically coherent character whose evil stems not from pathology, trauma, or misunderstanding, but from a completely alternative value system applied with perfect consistency. His psychology reveals uncomfortable truths about the nature of morality as convention rather than absolute truth, about what power does to empathy over time, and about the evolutionary origins of our capacity for both cooperation and predation. He embodies our collective shadow, the parts of human potential we've collectively agreed to repress in service of civilization. Understanding his psychology doesn't make him less frightening, but more so, because it reveals that his evil isn't irrational or broken, but internally logical and terrifyingly efficient. He is what psychology looks like when completely divorced from empathy, when power becomes its own justification, when strength truly makes right in the mind of someone powerful enough to enforce that philosophy. If this deep dive into the dark psychology of Sukuna fascinated you, hit that like button and subscribe for more psychological analyses of your favorite anime characters. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Sukuna's psychology or which character you want analyzed next. Understanding fictional villains like Sukuna helps us recognize and resist the patterns they represent in our own world, where power and morality constantly negotiate their boundaries. Thanks for watching, and remember, the most terrifying monsters are often the ones that hold up a mirror to parts of human nature we'd prefer not to acknowledge.